One of my favorite archetypes is one that I can really relate to because it's one of my main blueprints or archetypes in this lifetime, and that is the Hermit. The Hermit. I've been a so-called hermit since I was a child, and as far back as I can remember, I had a desire, kind of a need to retreat and seek my own little safe spaces of quiet solitude amidst, the chaos that was around me. A place where I could go within and contemplate life, myself, and really the big questions. I didn't know it at that early stage of my life, but I was seeking a hermitage. It was a spiritual calling. As a child and teenager, seeking a hermitage was also a coping mechanism or a survival strategy for me. But the truer, deeper calling was that of my inner hermit archetype. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the hermit and the hermit archetype today. I've often heard people using the word hermit in a sort of negative way, as if it were a bad thing to seek solitude or choose to retreat from the noise and chaos of this world. For example, an extrovert might take offense to someone who is an introvert or one who chooses to be a hermit, either temporarily or as a lifestyle, because they don't understand the true path and choices of the hermit, and they might actually take it personally. I have a good example of that. I had a neighbor about 10 years ago. Whenever we would run into one another outside, which wasn't very often, but I suspect she would sometimes look out her window waiting for me to return home from my monthly pilgrimage to the grocery store so that she could run outside and catch me on my way in, which she occasionally would do. She would then sort of pepper me with a barrage of questions and demands that I felt was kind of a lack of respect for my boundaries. But I was always polite and kind to her anyway. I figured she might just be curious about me because I really wasn't out and about that much by choice. So she would say things like, she never saw me outside ever, and what in the world was I doing inside all that time? I actually had my own little private yard and garden where I spent almost every afternoon gardening or having tea and a snack at my little table. And I spent nights walking the winding little path back and forth to get some exercise while listening to the crickets and, the sounds of nature and sky gazing. My own little private garden area was one of my sacred spaces. So my neighbor would ask, why didn't I ever knock on her door to party with her? And that I really should make more of an effort to socialize with her. Now, I knew she had good intentions, like I said, but no matter how nicely I declined her offers or explained my situation, she seemed to take it personally. She was an extroverted bartender and a regular partier who liked to be around a lot of noise and a lot of people. That was her happy place, and she wanted me to join her in her happy place. That's cool. There's nothing wrong with that. To each their own and all of that. But I was, and still am, the opposite by my nature. Her happy place is actually very draining for me, and it can literally take me days or weeks to recover from just one exposure. So I have to be very discriminating about my social activities, and that's really hard for some people who are not hermits, who are not introverts, to understand. So at first it kind of bothered me a little that I felt like she was judging me and she wasn't hearing me when I told her things like, thank you for asking, I really appreciate it, it's not personal, please don't take it personally, I just need my solitude and quiet time at home right now. But it still seemed like she felt her desires and needs were greater than my desire and need for solitude and self-reflection, for healing and recharging my often world-weary drained battery and chemically assaulted body. More on that later. So one night she stopped me when I was carrying my groceries in on my way back inside, and again in a relatively accusatory, judgmental tone, she asked why I never wanted to party with her. She was slurring her words and was pretty wasted at the time. So after about a year or so of this, since she moved next door to me, I thought, enough is enough, all right? And I decided to try to explain it to her in a way that might be more easily understood. And also to ease her mind, that it wasn't about her and that she shouldn't take it personally. So I told her, think of the situation and me like this. I'm a nun who chooses to be cloistered for my own personal healing and spiritual reasons. I told her that my tiny home, which I called the dollhouse at the time, because it really was like living in a dollhouse, was actually my little monastery temple, my sacred space, where I was choosing to be cloistered. And that part of my daily practice was silence. I don't actually know if she heard or understood the words coming out of my mouth, but she hugged me and then ran away down the street towards the beach, chasing after someone. So, being a hermit is simply a different way of living in the world and how we protect and conserve our own energy, and the need to retreat from the world rather than constantly being in the world and of the world. The hermit just simply chooses a different path for themselves, not as a rejection of the world or anyone or anything else. Hermits can be introverts, but not all introverts are hermits or have the hermit archetype. And hermits are not antisocial. That's a misunderstanding of the hermit and not true in most cases. Hermits are not antagonistic. They're not hostile or rejecting of the world, anyone, or anything. The hermit is simply seeking inner knowing and a hermitage. A hermitage is their place to go within and seek solitude, often for spiritual or creative reasons. Whether that hermitage is their home, a special room or a corner in their home, an artist or recording studio, an actual monastery, a cabin in the woods, or whatever. The hermit archetype is thought to connote aspects of healing and recovery, particularly over time. The hermit withdraws from the world and its noise and chaos in order to go within to gather strength and to seek the inner voice or calling from within. In other words, as I've said before, hermits simply choose to be cloistered for these and other reasons. In Carolyn Mace's work with archetypes, she reminds us that in the olden days, hermits would retreat into forests or caves to get away for solitude and spiritual reasons. Mace was living in New England at the time when a lot of Vietnam veterans after the war were retreating into the New England forests because they had PTSD and a need for solitude. Not all Vietnam vets were hermits or had the hermit archetype, but they were seeking a hermitage in the forest for healing and recovery from the traumas that they had suffered. Now, there's a difference between something like a temporary need for solitude, which all of us humans can feel on occasion, and the true hermit and hermit archetype. It's something we're born with, and our hermitage feels like home, like home, E.T., home. Our hermitage is where we feel our best and where we thrive. There are monastic hermitages and monks and others who devote their lives to a spiritual path and limited contact with the physical world. People like Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk who sought a separate little rustic cabin inside the larger monastery where he was living at the time. Other famous hermits are people like Henry David Thoreau of Walden Pond fame and poet Emily Dickinson, who at one point had such severe light sensitivity that she lived in total darkness for something like 3 years, I think. That's not unlike what many of us with multiple chemical sensitivities and intolerances, or environmental illness as they call it, experience. We are canaries in the coal mine, so to speak. Those with MCS have sensitivities, allergies, intolerances to fragrances, light, sound, chemicals, etc. that most people who don't have it don't even really experience it or think about it. They're used to it. So obviously not everyone with MCS is a true hermit, but perhaps has discovered hermitage and retreat from the chemical-laden world as a solution and a necessity for their healing and well-being. Many have left the increasingly toxic world, so to speak, again, and have become nomadic, living out of their cars, tents, vans, or trailers, which are hermitages of sorts. The hermit wants and needs silence, not noise, stillness, not chaos, a need for contemplation and self-reflection, and a hermitage to focus on their inner self, self-care, healing, and inner space, which might actually be considered the new frontier, as Carolyn Mace has said. But as with any archetype, the need for a hermitage and solitude can be taken to the extreme, which can be a sort of self-imposed prison, or even dangerous or harmful for the person and the world. But that extreme hermit is really rare. That might be like a Theodore Ted Kaczynski character, the Unabomber type of hermit. The Hermit Archetype as tarot card. The illustration of the hermit on the card depicts a snow-capped mountain range that symbolizes the hermit's spiritual mastery, growth, and accomplishment. It shows the hermit as a wise sage who is sometimes dressed in a monk's robe and who serves as a guide and teacher. The hermit's lantern, or light, signifies the lamp of truth. The staff helps the hermit navigate narrow paths as she seeks through self-reflection, inner knowing, and mastery over self. The narrow path, as in the narrow way or narrow path that few dare to tread, which might actually be, again, the inner realm or inner space. The cloak the hermit is wearing is a form of discretion. Discretion is the quality of circumspection, freedom to act or judge on one's own, in other words, to think for oneself, the ability or power to discern what is responsible or socially appropriate. The elder hermit represented on the tarot card could be thought of as a wise person who will offer understanding, knowing, and guidance to others and the world. There's an element of the sage in the hermit, so the hermit is sometimes considered the mature, wiser version of the magician archetype. Maybe we should do one on the magician and some other archetypes, maybe. So this has just been a brief synopsis of the hermit and the hermit archetype. If you're a hermit, you probably know it. And it's easy to sometimes feel misunderstood or judged for choosing to retreat and find a hermitage for yourself. I think of it as an honor and a necessity because it's work that is much needed in this realm. So I think it's in this larger sense that hermits are seeking hermitage not only for themselves, but for others and ultimately for the world. And the more we can find, know, and be inner peace and understanding for ourselves and others through our consciously choosing hermitage, we improve the world from wherever we are, even if it's from our own little private hermitage. As within, so without, microcosm, macrocosm. Thanks for being here and listening.